pole dancer. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Pole Podcast. My name is Rosie Boa. I'm a pole dancer, pole teacher, and personal trainer. And I've started this podcast so that we can learn together, talk with the experts, read the research, and feel better on and off the pole. So if that sounds like something you're interested in doing, let's go. Hello, friends, and welcome to a hopefully very helpful episode where I really want to talk about things that have been coming up repeatedly for me in discussions with students, in discussions with friends in the pole community, in discussions, just with folks in my life. And really, that is around consistency and habit building and how to actually show up for the dang thing. And also, how much should we want to show up? What's a good floor to aim for, based on the research for how often and how much we should pull. And then conversely, what's too much? How do we know when we're doing too much pull? When should we pull it back, right? Consistency isn't always just doing enough. It's also always not doing too much, right? Like avoiding those spikes that can lead to issues and injuries and burnout. And also talking about some of my tips and tricks for helping build more consistency and also some things to consider around that. So let's jump right in. And I'll start with a little bit of, personal discussion about where I am right now. So something that I've really been trying to do, particularly the last half of this year, is be more consistent with my own pole technical training, right? I take classes. I'm a teacher, but I'm also always a student, always learning. And also recently I've been trying to add in a little bit more movement to round out my movement life. And of course, when I'm doing conditioning classes, those of you who are, take those drop-in or familiar with my conditioning club, you'll know all about those. I do certainly include that in my my training, but right now I'm at a place in my pole life where I'm interested in building a little bit more strength, a little bit more endurance. So I'm also adding in some other things into my movement life. In particular, I'm doing kettlebell, which is pretty fun, and also works on a lot of things that are, for me in particular, fitness weaknesses, right? So power is something that I've never been particularly good at, right? Moving with tempo, and that's something that kettlebell helps to really target. And also, I'll be honest, cardiovascular endurance. I am not, never been a cardio lover, and combining it with strength training that kettlebell does has been really helpful for me. So I'm working on building a habit for something that's to support me physically, that I don't dislike doing, right? I don't dislike the kettlebell, but I never jump out of bed in the morning being like, oh boy, it's kettlebell day. I can't wait to, get my ass kicked. So these are also some things that I've been thinking about as well as I've been sort of, adjusting my training schedule in my life. And the first thing that I think is helpful to think about when you are looking at your training schedule, when you're thinking about, what it is that you want out of pole and what you want out of exercise more generally is the benefits that you can get from exercise. And probably the biggest benefit from exercise, besides, ideally it feels good sometimes, you have fun, you have a nice time, is it helps you live longer, right? It reduces all-cause mortality. We have pretty good experimental evidence about it. And specifically in 2022, there were a couple pretty big cohort studies that came out. So cohort studies are, you look at a lot of people over time and see what happens to them, basically. And specifically trying to dial down a little bit more into what amount of exercise, how are you going to get the most bang for your buck? Because we've probably all heard various guidelines, right? 20 minutes a day, 2.5 hours a week, all that sort of stuff. And so now we have a little bit more evidence about when you're going to get the most benefit. And again, both of these studies came out in 2022. So the first one looked at 80,000 US adults. These are both on US adults, which, it's a well-studied population, and also the population I happen to be in. So, and basically they were looking at both high intensity and moderate intensity exercise. And a good sort of litmus test for this is in moderate intensity exercise, you can talk while you're doing it. So sort of like a light aerobics would be moderate intensity, a walk. And once it starts to get a little bit hard to talk during it, then it's probably a little bit more vigorous. So I would say pole generally is in the more vigorous side of things, unless it's like a stretch class or something. And so this study is by Lee et al. It was in Circulation, and the title, and this will be linked in the description as well, is Long-Term Leisure Time Physical Activity Intensity and All-Cause and Cause-Specific Mortality, a prospective cohort of U.S. adults from 2022. And basically what they found was that it doesn't really matter if you're doing, super vigorous exercise, not super vigorous exercise. You can do a mix or match of them. And if you're doing vigorous physical activity, right, so where you have a hard time talking to it, about 150 to 300 minutes a week, right? So, 2.5 hours in that range. And then if you are bumping it down to more moderate physical activity, so this would be like going for a walk, right, in the 300 to 600 minute a week range. So in there is when they were seeing the maximal benefit of mortality reduction, and anything more than that was not going to be, you weren't going to see any additional benefit, right? And generally, 5-6 hours a week or more, that's where you're really going to be training, because you're training for something specific. If you're just, moving in your body to feel good and for your health, I think that's for most folks going to be overkill. And if you think about it, that's 1 hour a day every single weekday. That's quite a bit of time just spent working out. So right around, I would say, general guidance, right around that 3 hours a week mark. And then there was another study with 400,000 US adults. This one was quite a bit bigger. And they were US adults, but it was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, also in 2022. And this is by Coleman et al. Dose Response Association of Aerobic and Muscle Strengthening Physical Activity with Mortality, a national cohort study of 416,420 US adults. So that's the specific number of participants. Sorry about the banging. It's so loud. And basically what they found was that, so they have some really great graphs if you're familiar with, sort of the inverse logarithmic curve, where it starts really high, and then as you go over the first little bit you go over, it drops tremendously, and then it sort of like peters out. That's what their results look like for the effects of increasing duration of exercise in a week to the mortality reduction. So again, you don't die. And basically what they found was after about 3 hours a week, you're not seeing much additional benefit, but that first hour, just adding in 1 hour of physical activity a week, is where you actually saw the majority of the benefit. So going from 0 to 1, absolutely huge benefit. Going from 0 to 3, pretty good benefit. Going from 3 upwards, it doesn't really make a difference. And again, sort of at that range, I would only really be training that way if you were looking for a specific physical, goal. So a great example is that, the kettlebell that I'm doing does take me into that range with my own personal training schedule. And that's because specifically I'm trying to build my power and my endurance, my cardiovascular endurance. So I have a specific performance goal associated with that additional training. So that's sort of the general guideline. If you're like, okay, how much pole should I actually be doing? That first hour going to be super helpful. More than 3 hours a week, that's plenty, right? At that point, hopefully you have a specific reason why you're doing it. And actually, this is why. So if you're familiar with my Pole for Pleasure membership, which is basically the membership where you get all my online classes, and also some other stuff, like you get all my courses that I'm doing, self-paced courses. That's why it's 3 hours a week, right? And it's a mix of strength training and, pole, obviously. So different aspects of fitness in there. But, that's about the amount that you need to get the most benefit you possibly can from exercise, just in terms of your health and well-being. So I have reasons for why I do things usually. I don't always tell people them, though. I gotta get better about that. So the converse, right? exercising too much. And this is something that I think is really good to talk about, particularly at this time of year, because it's getting close to January. Oh, it's coming up. And in January, a lot of people really, try to ramp up the amount of exercise they're doing. They try to really increase their movement diet, increase the amount of movement in their movement diet. You also tend to get a lot of injuries. And I think that it's really helpful to have, sort of I'm trying for this much, but I don't want to do this much. And there's a couple things to think about here. So one is that your physical capacity to do exercise, comes from the same capacity bucket as everything else in your life, right? So the amount of stress that you have in your life, the more stress that you have, the less ability to do exercise you're going to have. And it's a little bit unfortunate because, of course, exercising can help reduce the negative effects of stress. But if you are exhausted because of just life stuff, you're just not going to have the ability to, waltz into pole class and do 50 inversions because other things are requiring your energy. And there's actually a really I don't want to call it fun, but helpful to reference study. And this is Mann et al. From the Journal of Strength and Conditioning. RES. Response. The Journal of Strength and Conditioning. It was published in 2016. And I really like this because they were looking at U.S. football players who were in college, and then they were comparing the effects of physical stress, right? Like you've got a game coming up, or we increase your training or whatever, and then academic stress. So did you have a big exam coming up? Did you have extra homework? Were you studying for finals? Stuff like that. And they looked at the relationship with those things on illness and injury in the football players. So if you're not familiar with American college university football, they are definitionally not professional athletes, so that they do not have to get a share of the profits of the football program, but functionally they are professional athletes. And what they found was for football players during weeks of high academic stress, right? So they had, a big project due, they're studying for finals, something like that. The odds of injury were nearly twice as high as they were during weeks of low academic stress, right? So this stress that they had in their life that was not physical, right? They were studying, it was mental stress, doubled their injury risk. So something that I think that's really important to think about when we're trying to figure out, what's too much for our capacity right now is what's going on in your life. There's other stuff out there in the world. And, I am fond of saying eustress, that's EUSTRESS, is still stress. Just because you're having a good time doing something in your life does not mean that it is not stressing your body, right? So I think the holidays are a great example of that. If you love the holidays and you have a lot of stuff that you really enjoy doing, but it's additional stuff that you're doing, right? It's adding things to your plate. Even though you're having a good time, it's still stressful. And I think it's really important to take that into consideration when you're thinking about your movement. Also, something else that we've talked about quite a bit on the show over the years time period since I started it, is overtraining, right? And so this is really just when you are putting your body under so much physical stress that it cannot adequately recover. And as a result, even though you're training more, you increase your volume, you're not going to see an associated increase in performance. And in fact, you'll see a decrease in performance, right? So you just feel tired all the time, depression, anxiety, both symptoms of overtraining. It reduces your immune function. So just basically asking too much of your body. And this is going to be dependent on your current capacity. So if you are coming from having done no pole, let's say you've been completely off for 6 months, let's say you had a major surgery, you recovered, you've been cleared for pole again, you come back and you take 5 classes in a week, that's probably going to be too much for you, right? Or maybe even 2 classes in a week, right? Or maybe even 1 class if it's very strenuous. So the volume and the intensity of the training is really going to depend on your specific instance. And I've talked about that quite a bit in other episodes, so I don't want to get too much into it in here. But there is Another thing to think about with exercising too much, and this doesn't have to do with overtraining, this is, potentially still well within your capacity, and that is exercise addiction. And I bring this up because I think that for folks who are sort of at risk of this, January is a time where it can sort of rear its head, and is also a great time to talk with, a mental health professional if, this sounds like something that might be negatively affecting you. And basically, if exercising is negatively affecting other parts of your life, right? So if you are choosing not to do things that are important for your health and well-being because you feel like you have to exercise, I would say that's a worrying behavior. If you feel guilty for skipping a session of exercise, right? That's a worrying behavior, right? You're an adult. You know what your capacity is, right? We just talked about how your capacity is dependent on stress. If you check in with yourself and you're like, I'm too stressed to pull safely today, I can't go to class, you shouldn't feel guilty about that. And if you do, maybe a little bit of a dashboard light, right? A little bit of a warning sign. Another thing that I see a lot with pole dancers is if you are pushing yourself to train while you're ill or you're injured because you feel like you can't possibly miss out on it and you have to train, I'd say that's a huge red flag. And hopefully also any teachers or coaches that you're working on are also not encouraging this behavior. I hope they wouldn't. I hope most people wouldn't. But definitely something to keep an eye on. And also just if you generally feel like you can't reduce your training load for some reason, right? So I mentioned that I recently increased my training load in a couple ways, but I also, will, when I'm really stressed, I'll just skip classes. I just won't go if I'm like, I don't have capacity to do this. I can't be safe. And, I feel like that is a choice that I can make and I'm empowered to make that choice. I don't skip the classes I teach, maybe obviously. Those, I guess, I'm powerless to adjust. Or I guess I could, but I'd need more than a month's advance notice so folks would know what was happening. But if you feel like you can't reduce your training load, again, I'd say that's something that suggests that there is a mental health aspect to your movement that I would really talk to a professional about, maybe a therapist, one who's familiar with addictions. Another thing that I would, particularly for pole, I know a lot of people talk about pole is therapy. Pole is not therapy, but it certainly can certainly improve your mental health, right? I certainly feel better when I pole. I think a good thing to check in with yourself here is if pole helps you feel better, great. That's ideal, right? I think that's my studio tagline is pole should help you feel better, which is absolutely true. I completely stand behind that. But if you need pole to feel better, right? If you can't feel good without pole, that's another big warning sign, particularly if you're like, I need to pole every day because that's the only thing that, prevents me from becoming super irritable and moody. Definitely talk to someone if that's where you are right now. That doesn't tell me that you have a really good relationship with movement right now. It tells me your relationship is one that you may want to explore a little bit further with professional help. So, and just to sort of give you an idea of how common this is, looking at the population as a whole of adults in the US, again, sorry, that's the population people look at, about 3% of adults are estimated to suffer from exercise addiction, and that's based on clarifying exercise addiction, differential diagnosis, co-occurring disorders, and phases of addiction from 2011 by Fremeth et al. And all of the studies I'm citing are going to be in the description. The real question is why I chose to use Vancouver for these citations, and the answer is I don't know. I should not have done that. I'm an APA girly, and I put them in a different format. Oh well. Yeah, so that's too much. And again, I think it's helpful to think about in January because I think a lot of us are going to get messages that we are not doing enough, that we need to push ourselves more. And I want you to really feel empowered to check in with yourself and be like, is that true for me right now? And if the answer is no, then I'm giving you a hall pass that you can just hand to anyone who's trying to pressure you into exercising more than is good for you, that just says, leave me alone. Here you go. I'm handing it to you now. Okay, so that's, a good floor. The first hour, super beneficial. Up to 3 hours a week, still great. More than 5 or 6, I would think, you probably want a specific goal that you're working towards in that range. Knowing when you're doing too much, your capacity is going to be dependent on your stress. Overtraining, definitely a thing. Exercise addiction, also definitely a thing. Just, be aware of them, keep an eye out for them. But then if we are trying to build habits, right? So if you're like, I've been kind of inconsistent. I want to start building a little bit more consistency. What are some ways that I can do that? So there's actually a really nice study, again, that I like to cite from 2015 in the journal Behavioral Medicine, and this is by Kashal and Rhodes. Exercise habit formation in new gym members, a longitudinal study. This is a really cool study where they looked at people who are like, I'm going to the gym, I've never gone to the gym before, and what sorts of habits were most effective for having them actually keep showing up and build a habit. And what they found was that 3 hours a week over 6 weeks, people who stuck to that sort of, and roughly some variation, but stuck to roughly that schedule, were the most successful in being able to really develop this habit of going to the gym, which is something that they wanted to do. So and I would say, you can get those 3 hours from wherever you like. That also happens to be what my membership is. Again, because I'm basing it on the research. But whatever you're doing, if you can, consistently get it on your schedule and show up 3 hours a week for 6 hours, 3 hours a week for 6 weeks, will give you a really solid foundation to build a habit. And also just some other things, tips, tricks from my experience and my students' experience. I think the number one is find something you have fun doing. I mean, you're listening to this. I think probably you have already done that. Congratulations. That's the number one tip. Presumably, you really like pole dance. And even if you're not necessarily just doing pole dance, right? Hopefully you're adding some cross training as well. But like I mentioned, I'm doing the kettlebell cross training because it's going to help me with my pole dance, right? So I'm motivated to do this thing that I like. It's fine. I don't hate it. It's not my favorite thing in the world, but I'm doing it because I want the benefits that'll make my pole dance feel better, right? So even if it's not the thing itself, it'll motivate you to do your cross training. And also give yourself grace and flexibility. I think there's, it can be really easy to fall into this sort of like all or nothing, black or white, perfect attendance record or failure sort of feeling or way of thinking. And I encourage you not to do that, right? Check in with yourself, be like, is this enough? Is it too much? Do I want to change anything? Do I need to change anything? And then remember, stress is going to affect your capacity for exercise. So if you're really stressed, maybe you're like, hey, I was gonna, work on a choreo piece for an hour, but instead, you know what, I'm going to do, I'm going to review some spins that I really like for half an hour. And that's my training for today. And I just reduce what I'm doing because I have other stressors, but I still get in a little movement and do something I enjoy and that feels good and that helps me feel good. So another thing, and this is particularly for my folks who are really motivated, who maybe were really good students in school and, love to add things to their plate, which is me, by the way. I love to add things to my plate. You gotta, listen, come here. You gotta be honest about your capacity. If you're adding something to your plate, something else has to come off your plate. Time is not infinite. You do not have a time machine. If you're going to add one more pole class, you got to remove something else, right? And it could be, maybe I'm going to talk about food for just a second, but like maybe instead of, cooking this wonderful fancy meal with 18 steps, I, do like ramen with frozen vegetables and soy curls. And I get some time back from having a simpler meal, right? That's something I eat a lot, by the way. Ramen with frozen vegetables and soy curls. It's so easy and pretty balanced. So, just adjust things, just move things around, figure out what's really important to you and what really brings you the most joy. And if it's pole, and if there's something else in your life that you're like, I don't like this as much, maybe you adjust it. Maybe you tell somebody no, even if they don't want to hear it. Ooh. Better than telling yourself no that you don't want to hear constantly. Trust me on that. Also, very helpful, start small. start small and add, right? So if you're coming from nothing, if you're coming from a big long break, I've got another session for Kindle coming up in January, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in joining with other folks who are looking to zhuzh their pole practice. But start small, right? Maybe you don't even start with a class. Maybe you just do, 30 minutes of mobility once a week, just see how that feels in your body. And then once that's feeling good, maybe then you take out the mobility and you go to a 1-hour pole class. And once that's feeling good, maybe you add the mobility back in, and you're continuing to check with yourself because it takes your body time to adapt. So what feels simple and easy for one person may not feel simple or easy for you right now. So add things slowly over time, checking with yourself, see how it feels. Also, and this one I think is not going to be as helpful for everybody. It's really helpful for me, but that is adding in some sort of social element to what you're doing, something that gives you community, that gives you accountability, that involves other people in some way, right? I'm not training in person, and I found that if it's an online class that's recorded, personally, I have a really hard time doing it. I have to show up live. If I don't show up live, I'm not going to do the class. So that is something that I've learned about myself. And if I'm trying to consistently show up for something, a live class is really the best way for me to do it for myself. So that may or may not help you. You can have an accountability buddy, something else that'll just give you another person who you can talk to and check in with and be like, yes, I did the thing, or no, I didn't do the thing. And then finally, and I think this is probably not something that everyone's going to agree with, but I feel this very strongly, is that it should feel good at least part of the time while you're exercising, right? It shouldn't be a punishment. It shouldn't be a penance. It shouldn't be something that you do because you are making up for another time when you felt good and now you need to feel bad, right? That is a really self-destructive way to approach a thing that you need, right? Your body needs to move in some capacity, and treating it as a negative thing, right? And doing it in a way that makes you feel bad is going to make you not want to do it. And not wanting to do a thing that you need to do doesn't make your life better. It makes your life worse, right? So, give yourself permission to seek out things that feel good, to change things that don't feel good. And I mean, it's pole, it fucking hurts, right? Listen, that's just, you know it, I know it. But, maybe if Superman is your least favorite thing and you hate it, you just don't do it, right? If you're like, oh, I'm not going to go to class because we're doing Superman, maybe you're just like, hey, I'm not doing Superman. I'm going to do the rest of the class, but I'm just not doing the Superman, right? And, as an instructor, I've had students who have, come to me straight up and been like, hey, I'm not going to do Superman today. I'm like, perfectly fine. We can work on other things. We have other options, right? And I don't know. I don't train with people who try to force you to do things you don't want to do. Just in general, in movement, all together holistically, not something that I'm a fan of as a trainer, not something that I'm a fan of as a teacher. And again, I think it sort of harkens back to that, punitive, militaristic, not very healthy way of relating to your body. So that's my 2 cents there. And if you're like, how feel good? That sounds great, Rosie. How do you actually make that happen? I actually have a free challenge coming up. It's going to start January 8th, and I'll put the link to sign up in the show notes. And it's a Pole for Pleasure challenge, and we're going to spend 2 weeks helping ourselves feel better in pole, right? And this is, applicable to however you're training. If you're going into classes in a studio, if you're training at home, if you're training online, if you're training with me, whatever, it's going to be applicable to everybody. And feeling good is a skill. Feeling good in movement is a skill. And we're going to spend 2 weeks really focusing on building that skill together. So I'd love to have you if you're interested. It's going to be all online, right? Nothing's live. You don't have to commit a whole bunch of time. It's just 10 minutes a day. And we're gonna start by figuring out what we want, figuring out what is good for us. And I know that sounds like such a simple question, but in my experience, for most people, it's pretty challenging, and we're really going to drill down into it. And then in week 2, we're going to figure out how, once we know what we like, how to do more of it and less of the things that we don't like in our pole practice. And again, this could be, something that you take with you to classes you do with other studios, with other people, if you're training on your own, all of those things, it's going to be applicable. It's very, very broad, just sort of a general pole skill about how to figure out what you like and then do it. 2 weeks. Easy peasy. Well, I'm not going to promise that it's going to be, super easy. I think there's going to be, some real thought and effort put into it on everybody's behalf. But it shouldn't be super time consuming and it shouldn't be super strenuous. So I'd love to have you if you're interested in that. And regardless, I'd love to have you back to listen to the next episode of the podcast. So thank you very much for joining me today. We've been talking about consistency, habit building, how much is too much, how much is not enough, what's sort of the sweet spot you want to aim for in training time. We talked about some of the relevant research, and then some of my tips and tricks for building habits, for building that consistency. And, it really comes down to try and make it fun as much as possible. Try and make it a good time as much as possible, because pleasure is a powerful tool. And if we can attach pleasure to things that we need, ta-da, we do the things we need and we don't feel bad about it and we all have nicer lives. And really, isn't that what it's about? So, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I've certainly enjoyed chatting with you here. And I will talk to you very soon. Bye. Thanks so much for joining me today, pole dancer. This podcast is a production of Slink Through Strength, the inclusive, evidence-based online pole studio. So if you're looking for a place to train, either off-pole conditioning and flexibility, or learning pole tricks and refining your pole movement, you can find us online at slinkthroughstrength.com.